Upon hearing the doctor's verdict, the doomed businessman prepared to write his will. But when he overheard a strange conversation between the nurses, "Look at how Isabella is buttering up the rich patient. She probably thinks he'll marry her." Emily, the nurse, had been mocking the orderly for a month, who spent all her free time attending to the patient in the private ward. Well, she's not that stupid. Though, of course, a poor girl with a kid, who no one knows the father of, wants to settle down. "Maybe she's hoping that when he recovers, she'll get something out of it," replied Charlotte. Actually, Isabella was likable to Charlotte, but she didn't want to quarrel with Emily. After all, her husband was the hospital director. There's no way he's going to recover. "Trust me, I know about these things. They'll take Frank Johnson out of here feet first," Emily assured. Charlotte just sighed. It was none of her business. She wouldn't have participated in these gossiping sessions, but it was well known that anyone who didn't side with Emily against her chosen victim wouldn't last long in the hospital. This time, Isabella had been chosen as the scapegoat. Emily didn't like principled and hardworking women like Isabella, and this cheeky one had dared to tell Emily she was overstepping and should remember that she was just a nurse. And modern husbands can easily disappear at the most inconvenient times. When Emily heard this from Isabella, she had a huge tantrum. She grabbed her hair, and they barely managed to separate them. Emily demanded her husband fire the cheeky one immediately. But thankfully, he didn't side with his wife, the gossip and troublemaker. Still, things were hard for Isabella now. Actually, this Isabella is very suspicious. I saw her work history, and I'll tell you, she worked in hospitals where they paid more than here, but never stayed more than 6 months. Of course, no one is going to put up with a bitch like that, Emily concluded. She was always trying to find some compromising information on Isabella, whom she had despised almost from the first day. So far, she hadn't found anything, but she wasn't giving up. Charlotte was wise enough not to argue. Everyone knew why Emily was so upset with the orderly. Isabella was just much more attractive. A fragile blonde with a cloud of hair and doll-like features caught the attention of all the men in the team. Even Emily's husband watched Isabella. No wonder Emily was furious. Emily, though not unattractive herself, had a vengeful and jealous nature that made her face look predatory and unpleasant. She was good-looking, with red hair and a nice figure, even though not very feminine, but toned. However, her arrogance and self-confidence seriously diminished her femininity. Emily didn't even realize how she walked, like she was on a parade, striding broadly and confidently. And the tone of her voice? Every year, it grew more unpleasant and shrill. Her constantly narrowed, distrustful eyes had a network of wrinkles around them, even though she wasn't even 30. The corners of her mouth were unpleasantly downturned, like an old lady's, though she was far too young for that. The hospital director, Oliver Kennedy, wasn't having an affair, at least not at work. But everyone noticed that he had started paying attention to women. And when he saw his wife, he wrinkled his nose in disgust. Of course, Isabella wasn't to blame for that. She never flirted with anyone. But could Emily be told that in a way that wouldn't lead to a quarrel? Of course not. So Charlotte had no choice but to stay silent. She sighed and headed to the wealthy patient's room, the one everyone thought was hopeless. It was her shift today. Isabella was already by the bed with her 6-year-old son. Isabella often brought him to her shifts. Everyone knew that her husband had suddenly left her 2 years ago. He didn't pay child support, didn't help in any way. So she had to make do somehow. Sometimes, Charlotte, who had a daughter of the same age, helped Isabella with George, and in return, Isabella often helped with her Grace's homework. Mutual support was important. Still, life remained a complex process of everyday survival. No one would truly judge Isabella, even if she really was trying to get something out of the wealthy, dying patient. Charlotte certainly wouldn't. She would have been happy that someone managed to break free from that hamster wheel. Thank you, Isabella, for covering for me. My daughter's not feeling well. I can't give you much, but here's something. She handed her money. "Oh, no need. You help me too," Isabella tried to refuse. But Charlotte insisted, pushing the money into her hand. Pride was good, but not in Isabella's state. Not only was she working as an orderly, but she also had to rent a tiny room from some old lady. And to make it cheaper, she cooked and cleaned for her. It was no life at all. When did she even sleep? And then people wonder why women don't trust men. Isabella's husband had brought her from the village, married her, promising she would always be a housewife and his beloved wife. But in the end, Isabella didn't get along with his mother, who judged Isabella's worth only by the fact that she didn't have her own house. And that was it, she was left to fend for herself. She had to start from scratch. The most hurtful part was that Isabella had sold her little house in the village for her husband. With that money, he opened a small shop. They had been happy back then, thinking they were going to live better than before. But of course, once her husband started earning more, his too simple wife, who had nothing to offer, was no longer good enough for him. Charlotte had met Isabella back when she was still a carefree housewife, living in the same house as her mother-in-law and her ex-husband. Everyone thought it was the perfect family. But look at what happened in the end. They tricked her out of her money, lied to her, and left her. And still, they continued to think of themselves as an educated, decent family. "Isabella, I'm sorry I had to gossip about you with Emily. I just really need this job. You know that, right?" Charlotte apologized. She felt ashamed for participating in such a conversation again. But there was no other way. If you didn't follow Emily's lead, you could be in trouble. Oh, were they planning to marry me off to Frank Johnson again? Well, what's wrong with him? He's a good-looking guy. I'd happily marry him, so it's not really offensive, Isabella comforted her. Of course, Isabella had no intention of getting anything from the rich, dying patient. She just felt sorry for her friend. She was weak-willed, easily manipulated by Emily's tricks. Well, Isabella wasn't a bad person, and there was no need to expect too much from her. It was nice that she apologized. That was rare nowadays. Well, invite me to your wedding then, Charlotte said, glad that Isabella wasn't angry with her. Oh, what wedding? I don't know if we'll even manage to save Frank. His mother is clearly doing everything she can to get rid of him, so her favorite younger son gets the inheritance. With these thoughts, Isabella went home. She had overheard Brittany Johnson, the patient's mother, shrieking at the hospital director, demanding that he declare her older son incapacitated, but for some unknown reason, he kept refusing, saying it was too early to make such a decision. What a family! I just can't understand how a mother could treat her son like that. Even if he's not the favorite one. But he's the one who supported them all, struggling from the bottom after his father's death. And this is the gratitude he gets, the hospital director said to Isabella once. Oliver Kennedy treated her well, but there was no hidden meaning in it. He was just a decent person, trying to be kind to Isabella and treat her with respect. Isabella even felt sorry for her boss, thinking how unfortunate he was with his wife. Emily, on the other hand, considered her husband impractical. It irritated her whenever he refused bribes for shady dealings. Oliver, that Brittany isn't his mother, she's his stepmother. Frank told me himself. His late father married Brittany when she already had a child, and Frank's real mother died a long time ago, Isabella told the director. She often had conversations with the patient when he felt better, discussing various topics. Frank had told her that he was 12 when his biological father died. That's when his stepmother stopped pretending and began tormenting him. He did everything he could to provide for her and his younger brother, Donald. He worked part-time from his teenage years. He didn't go to university, instead, he worked in a car repair shop. Thankfully, his father had taught him to fix cars almost with his eyes closed. He never married, there was too much work. Then everything changed. He opened a chain of car repair shops. But he never got the love he hoped for from his family. At least, they pretended to treat him well while he was healthy. But now, all they waited for was his death and the inheritance. Frank understood it all. He regretted wasting so much time trying to win their favor. Yes, fate often tests good people. It's unlikely Frank will survive. Such a shame. He's a good guy, Oliver sighed. He asked Isabella about her son and if she needed any help. Then he went about his own business. These occasional conversations with the hospital director had become a source of problems for Isabella. His wife had been told distorted versions of everything. And now Isabella was being pushed out of the hospital by all the nurses and even some doctors. There was nothing she could do about it. Isabella and George trudged to the bus. They had to return to their humble room. The elderly landlady, Stephanie Lamberts, had seemed like a kind and good-natured woman at first, but now she demanded more and more. She raised the rent and now wanted Isabella to not only clean and cook, but also buy groceries. So today, Isabella was carrying a huge bag for her. She had to go through the humiliating process of checking receipts. Of course, Isabella would never deceive her landlady and wasn't afraid of being exposed, but it was still unpleasant. It was clear that she needed to find new housing. But where could she find something that cheap? And yet, Stephanie sensed that she could keep pressing the single mother, knowing she had nowhere else to go. She had become one of those people who, when they feel someone's situation is hopeless, make life even harder for them instead of showing sympathy. It had gotten to the point where Stephanie started raising her voice and speaking as though Isabella had hired herself as a maid and cook for an outrageous wage. "Mom, why doesn't Dad call us? Is he not going to wish me happy birthday again this year?" George asked. The last time he saw his father was a year ago. Isabella had been in a dire financial situation back then. She had tried to ask her ex-husband for a loan, but he just exploded. He said a woman should have as many children as she could feed, and he already had a new life. He was dating a respectable girl. And there was no place for Isabella and George in his life. Isabella had threatened to sue him. They were supposed to meet tomorrow and discuss everything. Maybe she'd get some money out of it if her mother-in-law didn't turn Morgan against her again. But there was no communication or gifts to expect. Her son definitely couldn't count on that. Isabella didn't want George to know how badly his father behaved, so she answered his question evasively. "You see, George, Dad is ashamed of himself. It's like he listened to Grandma and kicked us out. But when he comes to his senses, we'll be able to see him again. Mom, tell him that I'm not mad at him. I've already forgiven him." George was surprised that his dad had caused all the trouble himself and was now sulking somewhere in a corner. "I'll make sure to tell him," Isabella sighed. She didn't know what else to say. At home, of course, the elevator was broken again. They had to climb to the 6th floor with the heavy bags. "Where have you been so long? Am I supposed to starve to death?" Stephanie snapped at Isabella. Lately, she had taken to bullying her. It was only getting worse. "Actually, there's plenty of food in the fridge, and we didn't agree that I had to come back at a certain time. I don't think it's my responsibility to set the table yet." Isabella tried to speak in a neutral tone so as not to make their already difficult relationship worse. "You little brat. Am I supposed to eat moldy food now? You think just because I'm kind and sympathetic, you can use me as much as you want?" The landlady shouted hoarsely. That was a bad sign. It meant she had probably already had a drink. Stephanie Lamberts was a widow and had told Isabella that her husband died during one of their arguments 2 years ago. Back then, Isabella had comforted her, saying it wasn't her fault. It was just a coincidence. But now, Isabella herself felt a tightness in her chest, and she realized that such a capricious and rude old lady could easily push someone to their death. You couldn't stop her with polite words. A well-mannered person was powerless in this situation. "Stephanie, let's see what's in the fridge. If the food isn't fresh, I'll make something," she said conciliatorily. "What? Remembering who you depend on? You should have said that right away." Stephanie smirked maliciously and reminded Isabella that the rent would go up next month. When Isabella had rented this room, she had told her about her difficult situation. But back then, Stephanie seemed like a kind, elderly woman, sympathetic and caring. Now, everything Isabella had said was being used against her, and it was unclear where she could find another cheap room. There was no guarantee the new landlords would be any better. Isabella cooked sausages, reheated mashed potatoes, and took out the salad she made yesterday. They had dinner, seemingly peacefully. This time, the storm seemed to have passed. But it was clear that someday, they would be shown the door. My neighbor asked me today if I rent out a room. She's ready to pay double. But since you're helping out around the house, I'll put up with you for now, though you're certainly a lazy one. But then again, you're all the same, Stephanie said condescendingly. Isabella didn't comment on that. She had heard the same from her mother-in-law, that the older generation was the best wives and housekeepers. This, despite the fact that her ex's mother couldn't cook to save her life and always had a messy room. Apparently, these were the fall legends. It was better not to argue and just nod, otherwise, you'd provoke another rudeness. The next day, remembering the upcoming meeting with her ex-husband regarding child support, Isabella took George to Charlotte. She didn't want her son to hear the nastiness that his father would likely say. "We'll keep our fingers crossed for you," Charlotte said. It wasn't easy for her either. Her husband occasionally cheated, and during those times, they lived only on her salary. But Charlotte was afraid of divorce. After all, the apartment was her husband's before marriage, and her relationship with her mother was such that she didn't need any enemies. Her mother wouldn't even let her live with her temporarily. She had holed herself up in a 4-room apartment and refused to let her grown daughters live there, even though they had shares. For a time, they had offered to buy their share of the apartment at a reasonable price. Even though her mother could afford it, since she had kept her father's savings for all of them, she made a huge scene. She said, "What is happening? Your own children are kicking you out of your apartment. Where's the gratitude? Isn't it enough that I gave birth to you and raised you?" In general, Charlotte and her sister with their mother decided not to get involved. All she could do was endure her husband, hoping that his next affair would end, and she would see a paycheck again if, of course, he didn't leave her for the next love of his life. As for Isabella, Charlotte saw her own fate reflected in her, a fate that might catch up with her if she wasn't wise. And this fate didn't promise anything good. She didn't want to end up like Isabella, moving from one rented place to another. "Thank you, Charlotte. The most important thing is, don't take George out for a walk. Let him stay home. If my mother-in-law sees him, she might say something unpleasant," Isabella asked. Once, she had made the mistake of forgetting that her husband and mother-in-law lived in the same house. In the end, they had cornered her son and scolded him. They told him to say to his mother that she couldn't pull on his sympathy. The child cried the whole day and walked around sadly for a week. That was something she couldn't allow again. But what could she do? Her only decent acquaintance lived in this house. She couldn't leave George with the crazy landlady. Stephanie couldn't stand her own grandchildren and never interacted with them, let alone take care of someone else's child. "Of course, Isabella. I'll be careful. Everything will be fine," Charlotte promised. And she told Isabella that the patient had been acting strangely during her night shift. He woke up, asked many questions about Isabella, and asked for her to come in. "All right, I'll drop by," Isabella promised, heading to work with some relief. At least she didn't have to worry about George right now. She arrived at work on time and immediately went to the patient's room. Her ex was supposed to meet her for lunch at work, so there was still time. "How are you today, Mr. Johnson?" Isabella asked. "I'm fine, for a man dying," he smiled. "And I know your secret. You're trying to save me, and I want to thank you." Isabella was stunned. She had noticed a month ago that the patient was being given higher doses of dangerous medications that he didn't need. But Frank wasn't that sick, and she didn't know how to tell him that they were trying to kill him. When Isabella first came to the hospital, she didn't want anyone to know her secret. After all, she had been a doctor. But then she was framed, dragged into a bad situation. They lied, saying that a wealthy elderly patient was critically ill, and although she saw that something was off, they gave him extremely strong medications. When he died, it turned out that the relatives had paid the medical staff to make it look like he had died of natural causes, and those who didn't know anything about it were blamed, Isabella included. She no longer had the right to work as a doctor. She left for her hometown, worked on a farm, and lived with her grandmother until she passed away. Then she met her current husband, who had come to a tourist base nearby. Morgan thought she was just an ordinary village girl, stuck in her 30s without a husband. When he proposed to her, Isabella was overjoyed. Her grandmother was gone, and there was no one left in the village close to her. Well, I'll dedicate myself to my husband, have children. Isabella didn't love Morgan per se, but he seemed polite, reliable, and pleasant. She hid her tragic past from him, and he thought he had just taken a naive, uneducated village woman with no experience. Isabella had never told anyone how often the deceased patient appeared in her dreams. Of course, she didn't wish for his death, but somehow, she had become an unwitting accomplice in the whole story. She couldn't forgive herself. That dead man often came to her at night, demanding that she save someone in his place, and then he would forgive her. Isabella would wake up in a cold sweat from those dreams, thinking, how am I supposed to save someone? I can't even be a doctor anymore. What should I do? Become an orderly? No way. I'd rather be a housewife to a man who doesn't love me. She already knew that her husband had married her just because his mother demanded grandchildren. But she was ready to carry her cross and stay silent, as long as she never had to step foot in the hospital again, where everything reminded her of the tragedy. However, her husband kicked her out, and her neighbor said she could get her a job as an orderly. There were no other job opportunities. So, her fate found her, and Isabella became a woman in her 40s, with a clean work history, abandoned with a child. People still wondered how she managed everything so well without ever working in a hospital. Isabella even tried to do everything slowly on purpose, pretending that it wasn't working out, but it was still obvious, everything just clicked for her. When she first saw Frank, who was constantly kept under sleeping pills, she realized it was all repeating itself. This was her way of correcting her past mistake. Isabella had overheard Emily whispering to the doctors about speeding up the patient's death. They were planning to increase his dose, and Isabella would have to act quickly to save him. So, Isabella started swapping the medications in the 4. She kept switching with Charlotte and others, just to make sure Frank didn't end up dead too soon. The patient didn't know any of this, but for some reason, he liked talking to her about life. People whispered that she was 40 and still clinging to wealthy men. How did he know what no one else knew? This is what Isabella asked Frank after he revealed that he knew her past and that she was trying to save him. I overheard Emily and my brother Donald talking. They said everything seemed strange. I should have died a long time ago, but I'm still here. They were planning to increase my dose, and you asked me to pretend to be asleep. Remember? You kept reviewing my tests. So, I put everything together and thought, why would an orderly be involved in this? I quietly asked around and found out you were a good doctor in the past. Well, the rest was easy to figure out, Frank confessed. Isabella looked at him intently. She had always been struck by the intelligent look in his gray eyes. But today, he looked especially warm. She knew that this tall, slightly chubby brunette was only 5 years older than her, but he looked as though he were already over 50. His forehead was lined with wrinkles, probably from having to think a lot about unpleasant things. Mr. Johnson, here's the thing. Since you know everything, I want to warn you. You must not go through with the surgery. It's scheduled for next week. You won't survive it. It's better for you to just leave now and not tell anyone, Isabella said. Isabella, here's the thing. Like you said, I haven't been taking any medications, and thanks to that, I feel much better. I'm just pretending to fade away. But I need about a week to sort a few things out. Starting tomorrow, my assistant with a medical background will be with me constantly. So, don't worry about me. But tell me, how do you survive on an orderly salary with a child? He asked. Not very well, but I'll try to talk to my ex today during lunch so he'll at least pay some child support. Hopefully, it will work, Isabella confessed. Well, soon everyone will know that they tried to kill me. I don't want you to get into trouble. You should quit today. Come live in my country house. My mother and brother don't know about it. My son lives there. No one knows about him either. I think you'll get along with him. Leonard's a good guy. Frank handed Isabella the keys to the house and a generous amount of money. She closed her eyes for a moment at the sight of so many bundles of cash wrapped in rubber bands. But you don't owe me anything. I'm just trying to atone for my sins. Isabella told him about the story with the deceased patient, after which she could no longer be a doctor. Isabella, I'm sure you wouldn't want to intentionally participate in something like this, and in any case, I must thank you. By the way, lunch is coming soon. Are you meeting your Morgan in the cafeteria? Frank suddenly asked. Yes, Isabella nodded, surprised. Well, I'll go with you. You don't need any money from him now, right? At least we can have a little fun with him. While I pretended to be asleep, I overheard a lot from Charlotte about what a scoundrel your ex is, Frank suddenly suggested cheerfully. Just wait for me, I'll put something on besides my pajamas. Trust me, it'll be fun. Anyway, you're quitting today. What do you have to lose? To Isabella's surprise, Frank winked at her playfully. She had no choice but to agree to his adventure. As Isabella and the patient walked down the corridor to the cafeteria, there were many gossiping voices whispering about the audacity of this orderly who had fallen to disgrace. She no longer hides that she's charmed a corpse. How does the earth still carry such people? You're wrong. Even before death, one wants to love. By the way, I'm going to marry Isabella. Why should such a beautiful woman work? What do you think? Frank stopped by Emily, who was loudly commenting on the couple. How dare you? You should think about your brother and mother. The news of the upcoming wedding of the wealthy almost dead man startled Emily. She had already mentally spent the money she would receive from Donald, Frank's brother, after the business deal was settled. I've changed my mind. It's time to live for myself. Sweetie, I have a surprise for you. Right in front of the astonished Emily, Frank suddenly pulled a very expensive diamond ring from his pocket and put it on Isabella's finger. Sorry, I can't get down on one knee right now. So, what do you say? I want all my money to go to you. No one in this hospital has treated me so well. Isabella knew it was a joke, but she was still stunned. Only when the ring was on her finger did she mutter, Yes, I agree, money is never unnecessary. And you're a very good person, Frank. Isabella kissed the patient almost on the lips. The man blushed deeply, but quickly regained his composure and said, This is the best day of my life. Let's not delay anything. Look at that. She's not even trying to hide that she's wooing a dying man. And my Oliver still doesn't want to declare him incapacitated. Emily suddenly shouted and ran towards the hospital director's office. She was shouting so loudly about needing to settle this issue that it was heard all over the floor. Frank, there's a great actor dead inside you. Isabella giggled. Fortunately, I'm still alive, and I'm happy we're making a splash. By the way, I really am going to marry you. So, try to persuade your ex to give up his rights to the child, Frank continued casually. Isabella had never seen him so happy. But why? And are you really not going to die? You shouldn't be wasting money like this, Isabella tried to gather her thoughts. Think of it as a deal. A fake marriage. I promise you'll come out on top. I'll explain the rest later. By the way, is that nasty, unpleasant guy your ex? Morgan was already in the cafeteria, seething with anger. He was furious that Isabella had shown up to meet him with a huge diamond on her finger. He worked as a jeweler and knew that such a gem cost as much as his apartment, if not more. Moreover, there was that arrogant man next to her who had his arm around her shoulders. Although Morgan had seemingly found the love of his life, a new love with an apartment and education, he was still driven by jealousy. How dare she? Morgan had planned to haggle for every dollar, twist things, and mock her. He had come here to humiliate Isabella even more, the orderly, the homeless single mother. And who was to blame? He offered her to endure his cheating, but she refused. Morgan, hello. Sorry I'm a bit late. Isabella couldn't stop giggling. It had been an unusually energetic day. Even hatred and envy seemed positive, like watching an amusing show. Isabella's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes sparkled. She had never felt as good as she did today with this strange patient, who had suddenly stood up for her against the whole world and fate. Isabella, what's this circus? Who is this? Morgan pointed at Frank. Hello, I'm a rich patient. Almost already dead. I'm taking care of Isabella, Frank introduced himself. And after that, you hope to get alimony from me? Morgan hissed. Of course, we rich people are very greedy and principled. I'll send all my lawyers after you. I'll squeeze every last dollar out of you and enjoy watching my Isabella become happy, Frank said nonchalantly. Morgan had seen this rich man on the news and turned pale. They had divorced 4 years ago. He had worked officially and the debt was not small. Such a rich man could easily cause trouble. When was he going to die anyway? What do you want? Morgan asked arrogantly. He tried not to show that he was scared out of his wits. Give up the rights to George. I don't want my son interacting with just anyone. As you understand, I'll take care of the family without you, Frank proposed calmly. And to both Isabella and Morgan's surprise, 20 minutes later, a lawyer appeared who began to settle all the formalities. By the way, I'm not sure this is even my son. If I were you, I'd be careful with this. Morgan hesitated and decided not to swear, just in case. With this unsavory and indiscriminate woman. With these words, Morgan, or so he thought, proudly stretched his neck. Isabella giggled again. Morgan looked just like a turkey. Well, I like a woman with a bit of spice, Frank said, hugging Isabella. In reality, Morgan was lying. His mother had already done genetic testing several times, and he knew for sure that George was his son. He just couldn't bear that his ex was doing well and humiliating him. After all, he was the great ruler of a 2-room apartment, albeit on the outskirts, but still within the city limits, and he was supposed to rule over people like her, these village girls and poor women. At least that's what his mother told him. Morgan thought life was unfair. Instead of rewarding the righteous, it was Isabella who got lucky. That same day, in the evening, Isabella quit her job, and Oliver didn't force her to work her 2 weeks' notice. You know, I'm not surprised. My wife already told me all about your romance. And, by the way, I'm happy for you. I would never declare this Frank insane. In fact, I approve of his choice. Let his relatives choke on their bitterness. And I'm waiting for an invitation to the wedding. Although, I'll probably have to come without my wife, Oliver laughed and signed the document. Thank you. It was nice meeting a decent and knowledgeable boss. I hope everything goes well for you too. Isabella shook the hospital director's hand. In the hospital parking lot, her car with the driver was already waiting. Now, all that was left was to pick up her son, then get her things from Stephanie, and then head to her new house. George will be so happy. Charlotte barely let her go. She was dying to know the details. They called from the hospital, and who knows what they said. What a quiet one you are. And why do I always hear about everything last? Charlotte complained. Oh, we'll talk later. Happiness loves silence. Isabella didn't know what to say. Plus, she didn't want to say too much in front of her child. All right. But remember, you promised to invite me to the wedding, her friend called after her. Things went a bit more complicated with Stephanie. Fortunately, George was waiting for her in the car, and the driver quickly helped move her things. "Sorry, Stephanie, I'm moving out." "Here, take the money for next month, since it feels awkward to leave without notice," Isabella said. "Awkward? You've completely screwed me over. You got close to me, promised to take care of me. I treated you like family. And what did I get in return? You just used me," the landlord said angrily. "Stephanie, but you yourself said the neighbor wanted to rent your room for double the price. So, everything will be fine with you," Isabella tried to calm the elderly woman. "Do you think she'll cook and clean? Where else will I find a dishwasher and cook? She was born and raised in the city. She'll just tell me to go to hell if I ask her for that." Apparently, Stephanie thought that all people born in the village just dreamed of serving city folk for free. Not to mention tolerating disrespect. Well, it's a shame it turned out this way. Isabella packed the last suitcase and handed it to the driver. Of course, she wasn't sorry to leave Stephanie, but there was no point in explaining anything to this woman. Let her live as she wants and can. It was too late to change her. "Well, go down the slope. Do you think I don't understand who this guy in the suit is? Or do you think I'm stupid? I saw through the window what car you arrived in. Let everyone know that you're a fallen woman." Stephanie, it seemed, had taken another drink and decided to shout her suspicions as loud as possible in the hallway. She didn't realize that she was only disgracing herself, not Isabella. "Luckily, the elevator is working today, so I'll take that instead of going down the slope," Isabella sighed. She wanted to thank Stephanie for the temporary shelter. After all, at that time it had been a way out when there was nowhere to live. But the landlady had become so furious that there was no way to end this chapter on a friendly note. So, they had to say goodbye politely. It was already getting dark when Isabella and George finally arrived at the luxurious cottage with huge windows that were lit up from the inside. "Mom, this is like a palace. Are we going to rent a room here?" George asked in surprise. "Tomorrow's your birthday, right? So, I decided to give you a surprise. I hope you'll like it." Isabella only now, amid all the concerns, remembered that tomorrow her son would turn 7. She hadn't even bought a gift yet. But no matter, there was money, and they could go somewhere. Let her son think it was all in his honor. After all, George's life hadn't been easy so far. "Mom, this is just too much," George said admiringly, adding, "It's really great that we won't be living with Aunt Stephanie. She didn't like us." The manager showed Isabella and George the large 2-room space with its own bathroom and toilet. "I hope you'll like it here. I took the liberty of buying some toys for the child. Leonard, the owner's son, helped me. I hope we guessed right." George rushed over to the pile of boxes. His excitement knew no bounds. "Wow, I've never had so much stuff. Mom, look, they even bought me a laptop." The boy showed her the new computer. "But everyone knows it's your birthday tomorrow." Isabella winked at the manager discreetly. Of course, he didn't know anything about it, but he played along. "Of course, tomorrow will be a celebration. What treats would you prefer, young man?" The manager asked the excited, blushing boy. "I love pastries. And if there's milk chocolate too, that would be awesome." "Did I ask for too much?" George blushed. He remembered that last year, for his birthday, his mom had asked him to choose only one thing, either a pastry or a chocolate bar. "I think everything can be arranged." "I'll see you at dinner then," the manager said, showing them around their new home before leaving. "Mom, thank you. I think I already have my birthday today. We don't even need to wait for tomorrow." George climbed onto the couch and started jumping on it. "You know, son, I think today feels like one never-ending birthday," Isabella agreed with him. In the evening, at dinner, they met Leonard, the polite teenager who looked a lot like his father. He mostly talked to George, asking which toys he liked the most and promising to show him a new video game the next day. He also promised to take him horse riding. The house was empty except for the manager, governess, cook, maid, and the owner's son. Isabella didn't ask the boy about his mother. She feared that she might say something that would upset or offend Leonard. After all, they were guests here, and he was the host. Frank had already done a lot for them. That night, Isabella slept very soundly. She dreamed of that patient again, but this time, he smiled and said she had done well and that he wouldn't return to her. About a month passed. Isabella and George were living like in paradise. The governess insisted that Isabella update her wardrobe and even went shopping with her. "Oh, it's good that you're a modest woman, but still, you have to match Mr. Johnson. He even allocated a budget for it," she said. To Isabella's surprise, they were accompanied by a stylist in the store. "No, this coat can't cost that much. For that price, you could buy a house in my village." Isabella nearly fainted at all these prices. "Isabella, please, just let me do what I've been asked to." "I also earn my bread," the stylist asked. When they took her to a luxurious salon for a hairstyle and makeup and then gave her a set of new cosmetics, Isabella didn't argue anymore. Yes, Frank was strange. But he was a decent person, and he was making her life better. So let him play his mysterious games. She didn't mind. Isabella understood at the same time that the fairy tale would soon end, and she wasn't planning to get used to a wealthy life. No worries, now she had savings. And there would be something to start a new life with. "Wow, you're unrecognizable. You're like a queen," said the manager when Isabella finally returned. She knew he wasn't exaggerating. Seeing herself in the mirror, she admired the beauty of someone who seemed to be 10 or even 15 years younger. The person in the reflection exuded confidence, grace, and a mysterious allure. It was immediately clear that this woman had been born in a palace and had never known sorrow or sadness. Everyone loved her, everyone was happy to see her, and no one ever belittled her or threatened to throw her out onto the street. The only thing left was to realize that this was indeed her, Isabella. She hadn't fully grasped it yet, but she hoped to get used to her new image. Sometimes Frank would call. He'd say everything was progressing, happy that she had reconciled with Leonard, and promised to visit soon. "Are you still in the hospital? They'll kill you there." Isabella was worried about him. Oliver Kennedy was a good person, but he trusted his wife and the other doctors too much. "Don't worry, everything is under control. I'm not going for the surgery. I've asked to postpone it again." "Money works wonders," said Frank. "Yeah, well, no, it's people who work wonders," thought Isabella when she hung up the phone. She hoped everything would be okay. Frank was a smart guy. He would be able to protect himself. Yes, he liked to play around, but it was clear that he was serious and had seen a lot in his life. A real man. He hadn't become bitter, he just stopped taking villains seriously. At that time, Frank was indeed finishing what he had started. He informed his stepmother and younger brother that he was going to marry the orderly. Now they were doing everything they could to push the surgery forward. After all, they could no longer give him any random medications. Frank had asked the hospital director for permission to have his own nurse from a private clinic, and Oliver was quite happy about it. Well, rich people have their quirks. He was paying for the room and even buying medications out of his own pocket. He decided to free up the hospital staff. Credit to him and kudos. Everyone should do that. Frank deliberately misled Donald and his stepmother, pretending that he was generally agreeing to the surgery. During this time, he learned a lot of interesting things. It turned out that the hospital director's wife was having an affair with his brother, and he had ended up in the hospital by accident. Emily had long dreamed of leaving her husband and living in luxury. So, she had convinced her lover to spike the medications of her wealthy brother-in-law when he visited them with their mother. That's how he ended up in the clinic with what he thought was a terminal diagnosis. Emily didn't work alone here. There was an entire gang of doctors who, for a good fee, helped carry out these schemes. Frank could have easily discharged himself and told everyone to get lost, but he didn't want anyone else to suffer here. What would have happened to him if Isabella hadn't been around? Such cases are one in a million, where a former doctor suddenly works as an orderly and turns out to be a person of conscience. No, he had to expose all these people. It wasn't right to send people off to the other side. Another reason Frank was still staying here was his stepmother and brother. He wanted to make absolutely sure that not only didn't they care, but they actually hated him and wanted him gone. As a child, he had done everything to love his stepmother. She had spoken kindly to him while his father was alive. Although Frank felt a chill from her, he didn't want to believe that the relationship was that bad. Moreover, his brother, Donald, was his biological father's child. And Frank just couldn't believe that he, too, wished him dead. And doing so in such a cowardly way. Yes, Donald had always been weak-willed but not cruel. It was strange and even foolish, but Frank needed to witness the ruthlessness of his own family who weren't going to coddle him. He needed to rid himself of illusions, and it wasn't that easy. During this time, he also uncovered another family secret. His stepmother and brother were talking in the second room of the ward, thinking he was asleep. Of course, they didn't know about the hidden camera. He had deliberately let his hired nurse go for lunch. "Mom, listen, is there any way to declare him insane? After all, he provided for us, bought us apartments, and never denied us anything," Donald said. "You know what? I've been meaning to tell you this for a while, but Frank isn't really your brother. His insane father lived with a worthless wife before me. Well, he loved her. And since she couldn't have children, they adopted a kid from an orphanage. So, Frank is just a descendant of some drunks or homeless people. Why should he live and reproduce? It's no surprise he was drawn to some country bumpkin orderly. The blood is showing," the stepmother said maliciously, twisting her face. Frank was watching the recording on his phone, and he literally begged his brother mentally to continue defending him. "Come on, Donald. Tell her you still love me. I defended you. I would have given my life. Remember that fight with the boys? They came at you with 7 of them. I protected you, and then I was in the ICU for 2 months, but I didn't run away. And then I helped you with everything. I was like a father to you." Frank didn't understand why his eyes started to burn, and only a minute later did he realize that he was crying. He wanted to stop watching the video from the camera and take off the headphones, but it was as if he froze. He waited for his brother's response. I see. So, we don't feel sorry for people like him. Why didn't you say this before? I always felt like he was worse than me. Now it all makes sense." For another 20 minutes, Donald continued to tell his mother about his grievances against his brother. Frank learned many interesting things. Apparently, Donald claimed that Frank had deliberately humiliated him with handouts and protection. Just tortured him. Wanted to show superiority. That's how it all sounded from Donald's words. "You're right, son. Frank doesn't listen to me, so you'd better convince him to do the surgery quickly. He doesn't have any other relatives. It's good that I separated him from that Brenda and made him get an abortion. I'm a thoughtful mother," the woman sneered. When Donald came in with a sweet look to talk to Frank, Frank already knew what the conversation was going to be about and pretended to agree. During the conversation, he felt disgusted by this traitor. "What's wrong with you?" Donald asked in surprise. "I'm feeling a bit off, I'm not well." Frank wasn't even lying. "Well, then it's even more urgent to get the surgery done," concluded the man whom Frank had still considered his brother. Frank had nothing left to do at the hospital. He had figured everything out. He had gathered all the evidence against his relatives and the fraudsters in the hospital. He called the driver and headed home. While he was in the car, Brenda called. "Sweetie, send me some money," the youthful brunette with plump lips asked via video call. Brenda had left them with Leonard 10 years ago. She had given up her rights to the child and had lived with a young husband for a while. Now he had left her. The upkeep of the house wasn't cheap. Although Frank had sent her money, it was never enough. Brenda spent too much on expensive plastic surgery. But Frank wasn't the type to get angry with women. Brenda had done the most important thing: she gave him a son. She hadn't fallen for the stepmother's words about schizophrenia running in Frank's family and hadn't taken any money from her. Instead, she had told Frank everything. Brenda had honestly admitted that she didn't love him and didn't want kids. She just needed to settle down in the big city. So when she met a decent, wealthy man, she agreed to marry him. And now she was bored, sad, and wanted to move to a warmer place. Frank didn't get angry. They had come to an agreement. Brenda had given him a baby, raised him for 2 years, and then Frank gave her money, bought her a nice house, and sent her off with his blessing. If above gives people free will, who was he to take it away? Frank loved Brenda, and it hurt him. But would it have been any easier if a woman who only tolerated him had been by his side? No, he didn't get any pleasure from humiliating the weaker ones. He was a normal, healthy man and simply a good person. Brenda, at least ask about our son. Or how my health is. Frank said ironically. Oh, come on, darling. Why all this hypocrisy? I met an amazing man. So, we're getting married soon, and I'll stop asking you for money, promised Frank's ex-wife. Oh, I'm skeptical about that. The last 2 of your wonderful noble husbands turned out to be gigolos, Frank sighed. Brenda was desperately trying to look younger and was picking increasingly more charming and sugary men. It was unlikely that anything would change. Well, a woman has the right to make mistakes, she purred coquettishly. Yeah, but I'm the one paying for them, Frank laughed, but he still sent the money. He didn't want anything bad for Brenda. And Frank was even glad that she didn't communicate with Leonard and wasn't planning to. It would only hurt their son. So, he was lucky in that sense. If you don't make a fuss, things will work out right in life. I wonder, should I tell Isabella right away that I really am in love, or wait? He asked himself aloud as he got out of the car. Better to say it right away, or she'll leave when you arrive. Frank shuddered. He hadn't noticed how the manager had materialized next to him. Marcus, you scared me. Is everything all right? Frank asked. He nodded. Marcus had been pulled out of a very unpleasant situation by Frank about 20 years ago. He had accumulated a lot of debt and couldn't pay it off. Frank happened to take a taxi that Marcus worked for, and that's how things started to change for him. Now, Marcus lived with his family in the same house. He no longer took loans and was the most loyal and honest manager Frank could have asked for. In fact, Frank hadn't expected that after paying off his debts, Marcus would serve him so faithfully, but since that was how things turned out, Frank was grateful. He wanted to ask something else, but she came out to meet him. Frank's jaw dropped. Yeah, I should tell her right away. Marcus is right, or she'll fly off, thought Frank. That same evening, he confessed to Isabella that he truly wanted to try to build a lifelong relationship with her, and the story about the fake marriage was just to make sure he wouldn't lose her. Isabella admitted that she liked him too, but it wasn't clear yet, and they needed to test the relationship. She didn't believe that such things could happen. A lot happened over the next year. Emily and the fraudulent doctors were fired from the hospital in disgrace. Oliver divorced Emily, not because of that, but after discovering through court materials that his wife had been unfaithful. His stepmother and Donald were also charged with attempted murder. Frank didn't take their apartments and money, but he told them they would never see anything from him again. During this year, Frank also managed to find out who his real parents were. To his surprise, they weren't drunks or homeless people. It turned out that his mother died during childbirth. It was unknown who she had been expecting the child from. However, Frank's grandfather turned out to be the very rich grandfather Isabella couldn't save, the one who appeared to her in dreams. He really did protect you from the other side, Isabella said. She didn't want to rush into the wedding, but a year later, they had to go through with it so that their daughter would be born in a legal marriage. Leonard and George were thrilled that they would have a new addition to their family. Surprisingly, they almost immediately began to treat each other as if they had grown up together. As promised, Isabella invited Charlotte and her former boss to the wedding. Her friend was very surprised when she found out that Isabella had once been a doctor. Frank decided to surprise his wife. He reopened an old case and proved that she wasn't involved in the scam. "If you want, after your maternity leave, you can go back to being a doctor." "Although I wouldn't want that, I know how much you love your work," Frank said. Isabella was grateful to him. A few years later, she did return to her profession, though not for long. Because in her early 40s, she got pregnant again. This time, with a boy. After that, she thought it was time to quit her job because her children and husband needed attention. Besides, Leonard was planning to study medicine when he grew up. She would pass all her knowledge and experience to him. As for her, simple family happiness was enough.